Hello. Um, I want to discuss a subject that I've been meaning to talk about for some time, but there's been so many reports on this subject. There's a huge body of information available. What I wanted to do was sort of wait until I got a lot of information together, but I'm just going to make this video and say some of my thoughts that I have right now. And maybe I'll make another video later on, but I want to just express some of my thoughts right now whilst they're fresh in my mind. So this isn't going to be a very, very comprehensive video looking at all the ins and outs, but I do want to talk about it. And the subject is migrant crisis in Europe. This has been a very, very topical issue this year, arguably the most topical issue of 2015. The reason I want to limit this video to migrant crisis in Europe as opposed to situations in other parts of the world is because that's where most of the media focus has been, and it is a very topical subject. I mean, the thing is, it's not unique to Europe. I mean, Southeast Asia is also witnessing something of a migrant crisis with the Rohingya people in Burma. Um, there's a similar situation between the waters of Indonesia and Australia as there is between North Africa and Europe. But I'm going to just talk about Europe here. Also, perhaps my title is somewhat misleading, Europe's migrant crisis, because one of the least reported facts about this is that actually the majority of immigrants do not end up in EU states. Um, at the moment, Turkey, for example, has 1.8 million migrants from recent conflicts, from recent situations. 1.8 million. That's not, I'm not talking about the resident immigrant population over a long period of time, which is a slightly different thing, but from recent conflicts, so the war in Syria in particular, 1.8 million people. Now, what we are seeing in Britain is minuscule by comparison, really minuscule. Germany's taken a lot more, and from what I understand, Chancellor Merkel has called on us to play a bit more of a role. Um, the problem is if you take a position on this of trying to make a humane argument, then right wingers immediately brand you an namby-pamby liberal who believes in unlimited immigration. I've always taken a centrist approach to immigration. I shouldn't say always, but recently I've taken a centrist approach to immigration. I believe that every country in the world has a right to know who's coming in and to have reasonable controls. I do believe in control, and I do believe in background checks on individuals. However, I also believe in a humane approach to this, and I believe that we have a moral duty as a nation to help desperate people. Um, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Number one is, and it isn't being helped by some politicians, including, unfortunately, the Prime Minister, using words like a swarm of immigrants. That's misleading because it implies that we are being taken over. And then every buffoon who believes what they want to believe in the tabloid press really takes that language on board, and it really gets into their mind and they believe it. I'm going to speak about the tabloids in a minute because I believe that's a very important aspect of this. But we are not being swamped by immigrants. I appreciate that in certain parts of the country there's going to be a bigger influx, like the southeast is going to see a higher proportion, for example, than where I am in the northeast of England. Um, Ironically, sometimes the most defensive reactions and the most support for far right groups tends to actually be in areas where there's a lower influx of immigrants. I mean, the Northeast has, unless I'm mistaken, the lowest influx of immigration in the UK, with the possible exception of the Scottish Highlands and Northern Ireland. But it has the lowest influx in the UK, and yet it also has some of the most support for far right groups. Um, Most immigrants in the UK go to the southeast. Um, but I really think it's important to look at the facts. I mean, there's countries that have far more to handle than we do as a nation, um, are dealing with a much higher proportion than we are. Look at Greece. Um, you know, Greece hasn't been out of the news this year in terms of its own financial crisis, and they're seeing a terrible situation on the ground. They really are being overwhelmed. Um, Malta, Italy have really dealt with the bulk of this humanitarian crisis because whenever there's been migrant ferry disasters on the Mediterranean, well over 2,000 people drowned this year alone, which makes it the worst year on record in recent memory. It's always Italy and Malta that deal with that much more than Britain or France. And France probably has a higher proportion than Britain. So the attitudes in this country are totally taken out of context compared to what other countries are facing. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that there's countries that have had political violence of their own, such as Lebanon and Iraq. I mean, Iraq is one of the most dangerous countries in the world. They actually have a huge influx of immigrants of their own, So there is a lot of misinformation put out there, and that really makes me angry. That isn't about being a namby-pamby liberal or being, you know, left wing. This is not about left wing to me. This is about just common sense. The fact of the matter is, there are other countries that take a much higher proportion than we do. Um, Now, I mentioned tabloids a minute ago. I do believe this is important to talk about. Frankly, it makes my blood boil to see the sort of irresponsible reporting that some of our gutter rags are guilty of. I'm particularly thinking of the likes of the Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Mail. Um, you know, what's the worst out of those? I don't know. There's also an inconsistency and a downright hypocrisy from them. I mean, I've just come off the Daily Mail website. They've got pictures of children, for example, in Greece, where a lot of the migrants have arrived, and the photos on the surface look like they're being sympathetic. But the very same newspaper will then demonize these people as soon as they arrive in the UK. If they arrive in the UK, they'll come out with headlines like migrants are taking over the country or, 100 more illegals let in. These are the sort of headlines that are absolutely embodied by the tabloid press. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is crocodile tears. They can express sympathy when it's happening somewhere else, but as soon as we need to take some responsibility, then the language automatically changes, and I think that's despicable. Other rags like the Daily Express don't even bother trying to show any compassionate language whatsoever. I think I think it's incredible when the likes of the Daily Express denounce far right groups like the BNP, which hasn't much of a presence nowadays, but has been replaced by other groups, and yet pretty much it is a far right newspaper. There's no way to gloss it over. The Daily Express is a far right newspaper. In terms of its language, in terms of its approach, in terms of the way it demonizes these people, yeah, it's a far right newspaper. Now, I am not naive about this subject. I am not saying that every single migrant is a saint, is a completely innocent person. Um, when you're dealing with thousands upon thousands of people, there are going to be some unsavory characters. That's why I'm saying that there should be background checks on individuals coming in. Um, so, for example, if someone is viably part of a terrorist group or they have a history of criminal behavior or something like that, then I wouldn't have a big problem with being very wary about letting them in. But men, women, and children who have are basically just fleeing repressive dictatorships and war, um, like that harrowing image of the father and his little girl. What sort of human being would you be if you say someone like that shouldn't be let in? You know, sometimes I get really, really fed up with how people in this country seem to think that problems that we have, and we do have problems, I am not ignoring that fact, but they seem to think that there's some sort of equilibrium between the things that we face and the sort of things that are going on in these countries. There's no comparison whatsoever. Yes, I know we have homelessness in this country. Yes, I know we have poverty. We've got lots of issues to deal with in our own right. But do you think that Greece doesn't? Do you think that Italy doesn't? Do you think that Turkey doesn't? Every country has its own domestic issues to deal with. That, in my view, doesn't negate a moral responsibility to help others. People say charity begins at home. Well, I totally agree. But the thing is here, it's not a case of one or the other. It's not a case that the government should help immigrants and ignore its own people. The government absolutely should be helping people in Britain. And, I'm a harsh critic of the way austerity politics has had an impact on the poorest in Britain. Of course, there's people suffering in this country, but to blame immigrants for that or to then argue that that means we just close the doors, I think it's really negating some of the issues here. There's no reason why the government cannot help people in Britain whilst also taking more of our share with this. I mean, the fact of the matter is, this is a crisis. We, at the moment, are part of the European Union. And frankly, even if we weren't, even if we were outside the Eurozone, I would argue we still have responsibility to help out. Now, even Nigel Farage in UKIP has admitted that we have a humanitarian responsibility on this. But when you look at the likes of the Daily Express, and I've just come off their Facebook page, it really made me very angry seeing some of the sort of comments. Just stupid far right fucks, quite frankly, coming out with statements like, I'm a patriot and we should close the doors, and basically really far right stuff. Um, and then when you get the likes of Katie Hopkins, Britain's most despicable woman, basically making hate speech against these people and given a platform to do so. Um, one of the Daily Express headline was, "Are you concerned about immigration?" I am concerned about it, but I'm a lot more concerned about the sort of language that these rags are using in terms of dealing with the problem. Just to be clear, I am not saying we should absolutely open the doors and let everyone in. I am not saying that for a second. I do support a controlled approach to this, but I do believe that we need to be taking more of a share simply because other countries are proportionally taking a lot more. I don't believe we're pulling our weight this time round, and I believe it's down to political reasons. Yes, it's true that we have a big population. Yes, it's true we're an island nation and there's only so many people we can take. But I do believe we could take a bit more because this is a crisis. Um, Now, of course, it is not just the responsibility of European countries. Needless to say, you have to go to the source. These people are fleeing authoritarian regimes or fleeing conflict situations. Therefore, the best approach to take to that would be to get to the negotiating table, trying to find ceasefires in these situations. It's not black and white, it is far from easy, but that has to be one approach. Another approach is international pressure on dictatorships to improve their barbaric human rights record. So I don't believe it's just the responsibility of developed democracies because they are developed democracies. These people are fleeing authoritarian regimes. One of the worst countries is Eritrea. It's barely in the news compared to other dictatorships, but it is one of the worst countries in the world. I spoke actually quite recently to an Eritrean refugee. He was telling me about this. He had broken English, so I couldn't quite make out everything he was saying, but I got the gist of it. Um, I just feel as someone who I've got a relatively comfortable life, and I think what frustrates me most of all about this is if you try to make the arguments that I'm making, people think that you're loony lefty, that you don't believe in any sort of controls, and you're just for unlimited immigration. That's not what this is about. It's about being a human being, recognizing that we just need to behave like human beings. These are men, women, and children in desperate situations, most of them. Um, I'm aware that the situation in Calais is very unpleasant. I'm aware that truck drivers, for example, are facing threats, and I don't have much sympathy for groups of men with knives and so on threatening truck drivers. But I've got a lot of sympathy for families, men, women, and children who are just desperate people who are trying to get through. I would say that immigrants who use violence in order to get here should be blocked. I don't think they have a right to be here because that's, obviously we need some practical approach as well to this, but I'll leave it there. I'm just going to be repeating myself here, but let me know your thoughts. A final disclaimer. I'm not going to tolerate far right comments on my channel simply because you have plenty of forums for that on whatever tabloid rag you want to express that. Um, I'm not calling for unlimited immigration. I'm not calling for a situation where we're just letting people in without checking their background or anything like that. But I do believe that we have a responsibility at this particular time to take more people. Yes, you need to tackle the root cause, and yes, there needs to be a situation whereby governments work collectively to bring down the number of people who are displaced by war and other ways. These issues are not simple, they're not black and white, and the solutions are very complex. But one thing we can't do is just sort of take this mentality of, well, it's not our problem, we're just going to pull up the drawbridge. Um, Put yourselves in their shoes. Let's imagine Britain was in a state of civil war. Let's imagine we, as British citizens, had no choice but to flee, and let's say we had to go to the nearest safe country. Let's just reverse it for the sake of argument, and we went to Libya. Let's imagine Libya was a developed democracy, and Britain was a war-torn country. We had to flee to Libya. Now, all I'm saying is people need to find it in themselves to have some humanitarian approach to this. Um, that doesn't mean that it's a loony left position. It's simply about being a human being. Um, I'm not advocating a Jeremy Corbyn sort of approach where we just let anybody in, full stop. I'm advocating an approach where we let more people in, where we pull our weight a little bit more in comparison to other countries, because we're taking a lot less in Germany, for example. Um, and you think that the people who are critical of this, do you think that Germany doesn't have homeless people? Do you think that Germany doesn't have some of its own problems? Of course it does. Every country does. But we are still one of the most stable countries in the world. So, in my opinion, we do have a responsibility, especially, and there's another side to this. Um, Arguably, a lot of these situations, we are at least partly responsible for causing them. Certainly in the case of Iraq, I remain adamant that that was a massive foreign policy blunder invading Iraq in 2003. So we are partly responsible for creating some of these situations. I'm not one of these people that are sort of like blame the West first. First and foremost, you blame the dictatorships that are guilty of persecuting people and the warring parties and warlords and so on. But we do have some responsibility in this. I'll leave it there. But it's harrowing to see what's happening, and I am worried that people are going to be get to a point where we're just desensitized and we no longer see them as human beings, but just numbers and just like, and unfortunately, it's already starting to happen. And I think the tabloids are largely to blame for that. But unfortunately, some politicians are starting to copy that language, not just in Britain, in other countries as well. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. I hope I have made an argument here that is practical and centrist, but also humane. If people think I'm loony left, nothing I can do about that. I know what I feel about this subject. Um, but I have contempt for the sort of approach that the likes of Katie Hopkins and our tabloid rags want to take. That cannot be the way.